All right, so this is going to be Authors and Works Tossups Thoreau through Wilde in the study guide. There are 60 questions, so I'm going to break this into two separate videos, 1 through 30 and 31 through 60, although it will not be broken up as far as the study guide. So let's go ahead and begin. Toss-up number 1. Two characters in this novel discuss the differences between grassy and starchy cow feeds. One character in this novel befriends Varenka, but becomes disillusioned after learning Madame Stahl's illness is fake at a spa in Germany. In this novel, one character is improperly upset after an accident at a horse race, and Stepan, also known as Stiva, is unfaithful to Dolly. Levin eventually marries Kitty in this novel, though she earlier loved Vronsky. The title character of this novel throws herself in front of a train. For 10 points, name this novel named for a Russian woman, a work of Leo Tolstoy. That is Anna Karenina. Toss-up 2. In a story by this author, Neville St. Clair abandons his job as a journalist and becomes a professional beggar after faking his own death. A character created by this author earns a lot of money copying Encyclopedia Britannica articles. That happens in a story in which the protagonist hides out in Jabez Wilson's pawn shop to observe Spaulding and John Clay trying to rob a bank. In another of this writer's stories, the body of Openshaw is found in a river, leading the protagonist to figure out that the Ku Klux Klan murdered him. This author of The Man with the Twisted Lip, The 5 Orange Pips, and The Red-Headed League created a character who lives at 221B Baker Street. For 10 points, named this Victorian author who wrote the Sherlock Holmes stories. That is Arthur Conan Doyle. Toss-up 3. This poet usually alternated between iambic tetrameter and iambic trimeter, writing quatrains in so-called common meter. This poet, whose works were heavily edited by Thomas Wentworth Higginson, described an unmoved figure who closes the valves of her attention. This poet wrote that centuries feel shorter than a day when the dews drew quivering and chill. This poet lived almost her whole life in Amherst, Massachusetts, and she used ungrammatical dashes to write "The Soul Selects Her Own Society," and a poem about a carriage that held but just ourselves and immortality. For 10 points, name this poet of "Because I Could Not Stop for Death." Emily Dickinson is the answer. Toss-up 4. In this novel, a character convinces Master Brackett to let him into a cell and claims to have learned medicine from an Indian in exchange for his alchemical knowledge. Town gossip links that man to the Overbury affair, and he is present when a child states that her mother plucked her from a rosebush. Another character in this novel says that she would have gladly signed her name in the Black Man's Book, and had her daughter been taken from her at the governor's mansion. That woman stands on a scaffold with Pearl and Arthur Dimmesdale. For 10 points, name this novel in which Hester Prynne is ostracized by her Puritan community for adultery by Nathaniel Hawthorne. And that is The Scarlet Letter. Toss-up number 5. The decadent artist Gloriani appears in 2 of this author's novels. The first is about a sculptor who falls for Christina Light. The second about the spiritual awakening of Lambert Strether. This author of Roderick Hudson created a character who is romantically pursued by Caspar Goodwood, but tricked by Madame Merle into marrying Gilbert Osmond. Another character created by this author of The Ambassadors tries to convince Mrs. Groves that she has seen the ghost of Peter Quint. For 10 points, name this American author who wrote Isabel Archer in Portrait of a Lady and The Haunting of Children in The Governess's Charge in The Turn of the Screw. And that would be Henry James. Toss-up 6. In a preface, this poet claimed that your very flesh shall be a great poem if you, quote, love the earth and the sun and the animals. He compared his soul standing in measureless oceans of space to a creature that launched forth filament out of itself. This poet mourned, with ever-turning spring, a great star that early drooped. He wrote that our fearful trip is done, and mourned a man fallen cold and dead in a memorial for Abraham Lincoln. For 10 points, name this American poet who collected A Noiseless Patient Spider, also When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed, and Oh Captain, My Captain in Leaves of Grass. That is Walt Whitman. Toss-up 7. The protagonist of this story is described as one of those pretty and charming girls born by a blunder of destiny in a family of employees. The protagonist of this story washes dishes for 10 years in order to pay off her ruinous debt, which she incurred by attending a ball held by the Minister of Education. In this story, Madame Loisel pays 36,000 francs to replace the title object lent to her by Madame Forrester, which she discovers is false. For 10 points, name this ironic story by Guy de Maupassant. And that is The Necklace. Toss-up number 8. This author wrote a novel whose title character falls in love with Mary, who is in love with a lost sailor named James Marvin. This author of The Minister's Wooing also wrote a memoir entitled Palmetto Leaves. She wrote about an escaped slave living in a great dismal swamp in the novel Dread. Abraham Lincoln supposedly called her the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war, referring to her novel featuring an evil slave owner named Simon Legree. For 10 points, name this author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. And that is Harriet Beecher Stowe. Toss-up 9. In one poem by this author, the narrator relishes a moment when only cabs can be heard and decries his horrible life and horrible city. In another work, this poet urges the reader to get drunk, stay drunk on wine, virtue, poetry, whatever. Besides, at 1 o'clock in the morning and get yourself drunk, a verse in another work by this poem claims that the filthy menagerie of our vices, ennui, is the ugliest. That work by this poet is divided into sections, including Parisian scenes, revolt, and spleen and ideal. For 10 points, name this French poet who included The Sick Muse, The Albatross, and To the Reader in his poetic collection, Les Fleurs de Mal. And that is Baudelaire, Charles Baudelaire. Toss-up number 10. A satire of this poem describes how one character had in mind the notion of what his whiskers would feel like on the back of her neck. The speaker of that poem notes how he sometimes brings her a bottle of Nuit d'Amour. This poem's speaker notes how the world seems to lie before us like a land of dreams, but really has neither joy nor love nor light. This poem begins by describing how the sea is calm tonight, the tide is full, the moon lies fair, and later claims that Sophocles long ago heard the eternal note of sadness on the Aegean Sea. For 10 points, name this poem set in a location where ignorant armies clash by night, written by Matthew Arnold. And that is Dover Beach. Toss-up number 11. The protagonist of this novel resorts to shooting 9 angry challengers with his revolver after his rival strips him of his lasso. The protagonist of this novel repairs a well to cause water to flow again into the Valley of Holiness. The novel's hero's nostalgia for a telephone operator leads him to name his child Hello Central, and he gets called the Boss after using explosives to cause a rival magician's tower to crumble. 500 warriors on bicycles are dispatched by Clarence to save this novel's hero after he goes undercover as a commoner with the king. Its protagonist successfully predicts an eclipse after he wakes up in the custody of Sir Kay. For 10 points, name this Mark Twain novel in which Hank Morgan travels back in time to Camelot. And that is A Kinetic Yankee in King Arthur's Court. Toss-up number 12. This poet wrote, "He did not wear his scarlet coat," in a poem in memoriam for Charles Thomas Woodbridge. The poem, Two Loves, written about this author, coined the phrase, "the love which dares not speak its name." This poet wrote, "The coward does it with a kiss," after declaring, "Each man kills the thing he loves." He wrote a letter to lover Lord Alfred Douglas titled De Profundis, and after his release from prison for indecency, wrote The Ballad of Reading Jail. This author created Basil Hallward and Sybil Vane in a novel about a sinful man who remains eternally young. For 10 points, name this writer of The Picture of Dorian Gray. And that is Oscar Wilde. Toss-up 13. This poet describes a soul more white, never through fire of martyrdom was led to its repose. In a sonnet he wrote after his wife's death. An epic poem by this author is named after an Acadian woman and begins, "This is the forest primeval." This author of The Cross of Snow and Evangeline wrote about a character who grows up by the shores of Gitchagumi and marries Minnehaha. For 10 points, name this American poet of The Song of Hiawatha and Paul Revere's Ride. And that is Longfellow. Toss-up number 14. This character is targeted by a man whose assistant is the one-legged Tungay, Mr. Creakle. Early in this character's life, he is sent to stay with Mrs. Gummidge in an upturned boat. While working for Dr. Strong, this character learns shorthand, aided by Traddles. This character, sometimes known as Trot, is sent to Salem House for biting Edward Murdstone, where he befriends Steerforth. A landlord of this character is named Micawber. This character's first wife dies after a miscarriage and is named Dora Spenlow, but then he marries Wickfield's daughter Agnes, who is pursued by Uriah Heep. For 10 points, name this title character of a semi-autobiographical novel by Charles Dickens. and that is David Copperfield. Toss-up 15. Binet advises one character in this work to take up carpentry, and O'May's character takes off at the end of this book. Earlier in this book, a letter complete with a fake tear stains arrives in a basket of apricots. Although one man in this novel initially moves to toasts with Heloise Dubuc, he and the protagonist spend much of the text living in Yonville. That protagonist pretends to attend weekly piano lessons in order to carry out an affair with Léon after losing Rodolphe's affections despite her marriage to the Dr. Charles, and at the end of this novel she kills herself using arsenic. For 10 points, name this novel about Emma, the most famous work of Gustave Flaubert. And that is Madame Bovary. Toss-up 16. This author wrote a novel about a man's addiction to roulette and another in which the suicidal Kirillov is willing to take the blame for the murder of Shatov. Along with writing The Gambler and Demons, this author described how Nastasia and Aglaya must be chosen between by the epileptic Prince Myshkin. This author created the illegitimate Smerdakov and the faithful Aloysia in a novel in which Dmitri is arrested for patricide. In another novel by this author, Sonia urges a character to confess to killing a pawnbroker. For 10 points, name this Russian author of The Idiot, The Brothers Karamazov, and a novel about Raskolnikov, Crime and Punishment. And that is Dostoevsky. Toss-up 17. In one novel by this author, Gwendolen pawns her turquoise necklace after losing all of her money while gambling. In another novel by this author of Daniel Deronda, the protagonist has a relationship with Philip Wakeham, whose father bought the title location on the Floss River, where the Tulliver siblings drown. This author wrote a novel in which Dunstan Cass steals gold from the title weaver of Raveloe, and another in which the death of Casaubon allows Will Ladislaw to marry Dorothea Brooke. For 10 points, name this English author of the novels Silas Marner and Middlemarch. And that would be George Eliot. Toss-up number 18. And one of this author's story, a Hawaiian named Kiwe purchases an object that must be sold for less than was paid for it. This author of The Bottle Imp wrote about the murder of Danvers Carew in a novel in which the lawyer Gabriel Utterson investigates the title characters. This man wrote a novel where Ben Gunn has been abandoned on the title feature. That work begins with the lodger Billy Bones being given the black spot and sees Jim Hawkins set sail with Long John Silver to find Captain Flint's loot. For 10 points, name this author of The Curious Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and Treasure Island. And that is Robert Louis Stevenson. Toss-up number 19. One figure in this work repeats the odd phrase, Nautron respok lorni virch, every morning, and several plates and utensils in this work are inscribed with the motto, Mobilis in mobile in. The owner of its primary setting gives gold to the poor in India and once saved a wounded pearl hunter despite his misanthropy. Near its opening, Conseil and the hunter, Ned Land, stand aboard the Abraham Lincoln with its narrator, Professor Pierre Aronnax. That trio survives the book's climax by escaping the maelstrom. For 10 points, name this book in which an elusive narwhal is actually the Nautilus, Captain Nemo's squid-proof submarine, a novel by Jules Verne. And that is 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Toss-up number 20. The driest thing one character in this work knows is a lecture on William the Conqueror, and a poem in this novel asks how Father William can stand on his head and balance an eel on his nose. White rose bushes are painted red to appease the decapitation-thirsty Queen of Hearts in this work. It features the Mad Hatter and the Cheshire Cat, who guide the title character after she falls down a rabbit hole. For 10 points, identify this novel by Lewis Carroll, and that would be Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Toss-up number 21. This author's review of a work of technological utopianism by John Adolphus Etzler served as the basis for his essay, Paradise to be Regained. He described Mount Wachusett as the observatory of the state in one work and claimed that the preservation of the world lies in wilderness in another. In one of his works, the section Higher Laws is preceded by an episode involving a visit to John Farmer's hut. That work by this man opens with the chapters Economy and Where I Lived and What I Lived For. He asserted that government is best which governs least, in a work that was partly inspired by his refusal to pay a poll tax that indirectly supported slavery. For 10 points, name this American author of Civil Disobedience, Anne Walden. And that is, of course, Henry David Thoreau. Toss-up number 22. In one story by this author, the narrator becomes hopelessly lost before stumbling on a group of boys telling local legends about drowned men around a campfire. This author collected that story, Bezin Meadow, along with My Neighbor Radulov, in his Sportsman Sketches. This author wrote a novel in which Anna Odintsova entertains several of the main characters, one of whom is a nihilist. For 10 points, name this Russian author who created the Kirsanovs and Bazarovs in the novel Fathers and Sons, and that would be Turgenev. Toss-up number 23. A girl in this novel becomes a governess for the well-to-do King family. This novel's 10th chapter recounts the meetings of a book club inspired by the Pickwick Papers. At the end, one of its protagonists starts an experimental boys' school with Professor Baer. In this novel's first chapter, its main characters reminisce about a charades-like game based on John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. Mr. Lawrence gives one of its title characters a piano. In this novel, the Hummels are given a Christmas breakfast by a family led by Marmee, whose daughter Beth dies of scarlet fever. Meg, Jo, Beth, and Amy March are the title girls of, for 10 points, what Louisa May Alcott novel? And that would be Little Women. Toss-up 24. In one short story by this author, a character recalls a poem that he had forgotten about a soldier of the Legion who lay dying in Algiers. In another short story, a wonder with a gun named Scratchy Wilson decides not to fight Jack Potter after learning that he is married. This author began one short story by stating that none of them knew the color of the sky. In that short story by this author, an oiler, a cook, a captain, and a correspondent try to reach land after shipwreck. For 10 points, name this author of the short stories The Bride Comes to Yellow Sky and The Open Boat, who wrote about the soldier Henry Fleming in his novel The Red Badge of Courage. And that would be Crane. Crane is the author. Toss-up 25. A character in this novel travels to a mansion near Tantridge in order to claim kin with a rich widow and later kills a flock of wounded pheasants out of mercy. A man in this novel who briefly goes to Brazil on a failed farming venture rejects the advances of the main character's co-workers at the Talbothays dairy factory. Mrs. Brooks notices a blood stain caused by the death of a man who earlier got lost in a foggy forest and raped the main character. At the end of this work, Liza Lou and Angel Clare walk away after seeing the raising of a black flag implying the main character's death. For 10 points, name this novel by Thomas Hardy. Now, I'm not quite sure, but I think this is Jude the Obscure. I kind of goof up and mix up those Thomas Hardy novels, but I think it's Jude the Obscure, but hopefully you will check up after me. Toss-up number 26. After gathering supplies, two characters in this novel hide in an attic garret and pretend to be ghosts. In this novel, Mrs. Bird, who has just lost a child, chastises her husband for new legislation in the Senate and encourages him to hide a girl and her child in John Van Trope's house. In this novel, Cassie reunites with her daughter in Canada after Eliza jumps onto ice blocks to cross the frozen Ohio River. Another character in this novel is sold by Ava St. Clair's mother to Simon Legree, who whips the title slave to death. For 10 points, identify this novel written by a little lady who started this great war, Harriet Beecher Stowe. And that would, of course, be Uncle Tom's Cabin. Toss-up 27. While on the run, a character in this novel overturns a table and grabs his blood-stained hat from a salesman who tries to sell him an invaluable composition for removing stains. That character in this novel accidentally hangs himself when he imagines seeing the eyes of his girlfriend, which causes him to slip from a roof. A character in this novel ties a rock to a handkerchief and tries to drown his dog Bullseye. Charlie Bates steals Mr. Brownlow's handkerchief in this novel with the assistance of Jack Dawkins, who is known as the Artful Dodger. In this novel, Bill Sikes mercilessly beats his girlfriend Nancy to death. For 10 points, name this novel by Charles Dickens in which the title character joins Fagin's band of thieves. And that is Oliver Twist. Toss-up number 28. In one work by this author, Masha marries Sergei Mikhailovich before their marriage suffers because of her love of society. That work is titled Family Happiness. In the beginning of another of this man's work, a woman debates with an old man about marriage and then calls him Domostroy after he leaves the train. In that work, Podnishev kills his wife after catching her with the violinist Trukach Hevesky. This author of the Kreutzer Sonata wrote about a magistrate who dies of a wound he receives while hanging curtains, the death of Ivan Ilyich. For 10 points, name this author of War and Peace. and that is, of course, Tolstoy. Toss-up 29. This character travels through Chicago, Buffalo, and Ireland in pursuit of a German spy, von Bork. In another work, this man learns the story of Agent Bertie Edwards and how he brought the Vermissa Valley gang to justice. In another story, this man tracks down ex-KKK members and accuses the crew of the Lone Star of murder. That story, The 5 Orange Pips, can be found along with others in the book titled For the Adventures of This Man. Another story in that collection, A Scandal in Bohemia, sees this character meet a possible romantic interest, Irene Adler. For 10 points, name the detective created by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And that is Sherlock Holmes. Toss-up number 30, which will end the first half of these sets of questions. In a story by this man, a dark figure welcomes converts to the communism of their race, or communion of their race, at a meeting where the protagonist sees the teacher of the catechism, Goody Cloyce, before chasing after the pink ribbon of his wife Faith. The Reverend Hooper refuses to remove the title garment in one of his stories, and in another, Beatrice is raised on poisonous plants by Rappaccini. This man wrote Young Goodman Brown and The Minister's Black Veil, as well as a book in which the protagonist has Arthur Dimmesdale's child Pearl. For 10 points, name this American who described the ostracization of Hester Prynne in The Scarlet Letter. And that, of course, is Nathaniel Hawthorne. So in the second video, I'll read the second half of the 60 toss-ups over the section of Thoreau through Wilde.